Hello, and thank you for joining our webinar today, sponsored by the Access Forum. My name is Anastasia Papas, and I'm the director of the forum. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome today Harro van Asselt and Peter Newel, who will present a recent paper on pathways to an international agreement to leave fossil fuels in the ground. Harro is a professor of climate law and policy at the University of Eastern Finland Law School and is a visiting researcher with the Copernicus Institute of Sustainable Development at Utrecht University. He's also an affiliated researcher with the Stockholm Environment Institute. He has over 10 years of research experience focusing on various aspects of international and European climate change law and policy. His work has appeared in numerous journals, including Nature, American Journal of International Law, and Climate Policy. Peter is a professor of international relations at the University of Sussex. He is a specialist in the politics and political economy of environment and development. For more than 25 years, he has conducted research, consultancy, and advisory work on issues of climate change and energy, agricultural biotechnology, corporate accountability, and trade policy, and working in several countries, including Argentina, Brazil, China, India, Mexico, and South Africa. In recent years, his research has mainly focused on the political economy of carbon markets and low-carbon energy transitions. Besides working for academic institutions, he has undertaken research and policy work for the governments of the UK, Sweden, and Finland, and various international organizations. Peter has written numerous books on the subject. But before I pass the floor to Peter and Harro, I would like to give you some background on our current webinar series. Today's webinar is the second in our series on climate change mitigation policies and international agreements. The first webinar was on September 26th, and the speaker was Silvana Tendiero of the Bank of England and LSE. She presented a paper she co-authored with Tiloka de Silva on climate change pledges, actions, and outcomes. Silvana and her co-author constructed a very interesting database that includes data on international agreements and climate laws and policies enacted both at the national and subnational level. They found that the compliance to the Copenhagen and Kyoto treaties was mixed, but the signatories of those two treaties did experience a significant reductions in emissions as compared to the non-signatories. They also argued for much more aggressive emission reduction targets going forward. And now I would like to invite you to answer the two questions of our survey. Okay, so for the first question, the Paris Agreement indicates limits on the production of fossil fuels. 71% responded false, and this is correct. The Paris Agreement does not indicate limits on the production of fossil fuels. And for the second question, which form of international agreement on fossil fuel supply would be more efficient in achieving carbon cooperation? 57% voted all of the above. 33% thought a multilateral environmental regime would be appropriate, and only 10% thought that a climate club would be the better solution. So Peter and Harro, the floor is yours.
Right, thank you very much, Anastasia, and also very nice to see the responses to the poll already. Let me just upload our presentation and get started. Hopefully you can see this now properly. Anyway, I don't think I'm going to say much news at the beginning when I'm saying that if we want to keep global warming below 2 degrees Celsius, as the Paris Agreement is suggesting, that emissions need to fall very rapidly, and that we also need to achieve net zero by the middle of the century. We also know that achieving the aspirational goal of keeping global warming below 1.5 degrees requires, of course, even bigger efforts than that. Now, to achieve these goals of the Paris Agreement and to avoid climate disruption, we need to explore all possible levers. And here in this presentation, we focus on one possible lever, which is fossil fuel production. Now, if we think about the burning of fossil fuels, including coal, oil, and gas, we know that this is the single largest source of greenhouse gas emissions and a major driver of climate change. Now, at first, however, the fossil fuel production plans of governments and companies were hardly considered in the climate policy context. And before you think that this presentation is actually about Justin Bieber, you have to pay a bit more careful attention and focus specifically here. I hear some background noise.
Let me interrupt you a little bit.
Yes.
Could you make the slides full screen, please? Because it would be easier.
Is it not full screen? Is it full screen now?
No.
Well, let me see. Let's see. Do you see the two things next to each other? So,
anyway, if it is not possible, it's.
Just trying to see. No.
There, perfect.
Yeah, you can see it full screen now?
Yes, now.
All right, excellent.
Thanks.
All right, well, again, moving from Justin Bieber to Bill Mckibben, who in 2009 wrote an essay in which he argued that the amount of carbon in global fossil fuel reserves was 5 times as high as the amount that could be emitted to stay below 2 degrees. Now, this essay resonated in several reports and scientific articles that popularized a number of concepts that you'll probably be familiar with, such as the carbon bubble, unburnable carbon, and stranded assets. And it also suggested that some fossil fuel reserves needed to remain untouched, which is also, again, something that you can see in reports by the Carbon Tracker Initiative and other organizations. Now, more recently, I've seen a number of reports, including the Production Gap report, which was published by the Stockholm Environment Institute and the United Nations Environment Programme, suggesting that countries are planning to produce 50% more fossil fuels by 2030 than would be consistent with the 2 degrees goal, and actually 120% more than would be consistent with keeping global warming below 1.5 degrees. What we also see in a more recent paper in Nature by Dan Welsby and others is that 58% of oil, 59% of gas, and 89% of coal reserves cannot be produced if we are to stay below 1.5 degrees. And similar messages were also conveyed by the International Energy Agency's report of last year. So the net zero scenario that the IEA produced suggests basically that no new fossil fuel projects can go ahead if we actually want to stay below 1.5 degrees, and if we are to achieve net zero. Now, what we are seeing in the meantime, though, is that this production gap that I pointed out in the previous slide is actually still there. And it's also increasing because governments are still providing a great deal of support, financial and otherwise, to fossil fuel production. This includes the licensing and permitting of new fossil fuel production, but also all types of public finance. And what you see here is produced by a group of NGOs from last year. It's the G20 support, which is about 63 billion a year in finance for fossil fuel production, which is 2.5 times as much as their support for clean energy. So even though we're seeing financial support for clean energy increasing over the years, we also still see a huge amount of public finance going to fossil fuels. Now, all of these studies and all of these numbers have given rise to a transnational movement to keep fossil fuels in the ground. However, what may have started as a slogan by people like Greta Thunberg and civil society and social movements now is increasingly widely adopted by all kinds of leaders, including the Pope and the Dalai Lama, but also some countries, including Denmark, New Zealand, Spain, and France. They all have begun to implement policies specifically to limit fossil fuel extraction, in addition to their climate policies that focus on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Now, these policies are often referred to as supply-side climate policies, meaning that they're policies that focus on restricting or redirecting fossil fuel production and investment. The examples are multiple. They include fracking bans, for example, or making certain areas off limits for exploration, such as being considered in countries like Norway and Canada. They also include other examples, such as reforms of fossil fuel producer subsidies, as is also being considered in Norway, or thinking about removing export taxes or imposing export taxes, restrictions on finance, fossil fuel finance, or compensation for leaving fossil fuels in the ground, which was an experiment that was tried and not necessarily succeeded in Ecuador about a decade ago. Lastly, fossil fuel supply-side measures could also focus on support for a fair and just transition for fossil fuel workers and dependent communities. Now, the literature suggests that for various reasons, implementing such measures can make sense. For example, economic theory suggests that it's important, as you can see here also on the slide, to cut with both arms of the scissors, tackling both fossil fuel supply as well as fossil fuel demand at the same time. But also from the perspective of environmental effectiveness, it might make sense to focus on fossil fuel supply, because we might help avoid carbon lock-in by adopting a long-term perspective, focusing on the impacts of decisions on fossil fuel production right now. Moreover, by addressing fossil fuel production, we can also plan ahead already for the transition, thereby minimizing economic disruption for countries and communities that are dependent on fossil fuels. Lastly, it's arguable that fossil fuel production, or focusing on fossil fuel production, means that we're focusing on a simpler object of climate governance rather than focusing on carbon dioxide or CO2. Because we know that already we can look at fossil fuel infrastructure projects, we know when they're being built, we know where they're being built, and increasingly we have the data to show that. Now, one might want to ask, and this is also, of course, the question that was asked in the poll, so to what extent is fossil fuel production already being governed by international agreements? And here, I think the majority that just said, I think was about 71%, that said that fossil fuel production is not governed by the Paris Agreement, in a way are right, because there is no explicit mention of fossil fuel production or fossil fuels alone in the Paris Agreement. However, that doesn't mean that the Paris Agreement does not have limits for fossil fuel production, or at least implied limits. Because if you look at the Paris Agreement goals that I already mentioned earlier on, of keeping global warming well below 2 degrees, as well as the aspirational goal of keeping global warming well below, or keeping it below 1.5 degrees, we can argue that these actually imply limits for states. So already I mentioned the several existing studies that show that existing fossil fuel production and the fossil fuel production plans by states are simply not aligned with the Paris Agreement temperature goals. In addition, the Paris Agreement also has a specific goal to shift financial support away from carbon-intensive activities, including support for fossil fuels. So these two goals, so the goals that we can find in Article 2 of the Paris Agreement, arguably together can imply limits on fossil fuel production and support for fossil fuel projects in the future. In addition, the Paris Agreement also underscores the growing importance of ensuring a just transition, suggesting that any shift away from fossil fuel production needs to take into account the impacts on workers and fossil fuel dependent communities. At the same time, it's important to note that the commitments related to fossil fuel production or a just transition are largely absent from the climate pledges that countries have made so far under the Paris Agreement, the so-called nationally determined contribution. Having said that, it is interesting to note, if we go back to last year, November, that the Glasgow Climate Pact for the first time includes a reference to fossil fuels as a way of mitigating climate change. So if you look at the Glasgow Climate Pact, you can see that there's an explicit call for a phase down of unabated coal-fired power, and as well as an explicit call of phasing out fossil fuel subsidies that are inefficient. So we see some changes happening in the context of the Paris Agreement. At the same time, if we are really honest about it, and going back to the poll here, we can say that so far the Paris Agreement and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change have failed to really focus on fossil fuel production as a major driver of climate change. So this is what brings us to the rationale of this paper and the reason why we need to think about international cooperation on fossil fuel production more generally. So the first reason why we think, or why we would argue that international cooperation is important, is to fill this gap by the Paris Agreement, or at least that left by the Paris Agreement, and to really try and close the production gap and try and help address fossil fuel production as a major driver of climate change. At the same time, for addressing or instigating international cooperation also is important because it would help to avoid so-called leakage effects of taking supply side measures unilaterally. Thereby, with what might happen is if you close fossil fuel production down in one country, the fossil fuel production might simply shift to another country. So having as many states or having as many actors as possible under one international agreement makes sense. But third, international cooperation is also important because it provides a means to provide international support, particularly to developing countries, to help avoid stranded assets, to help avoid stranded nations more generally, but also to help developing countries plan specifically for a just transition away from fossil fuel production, or at least the transition that we would argue is inevitable. So making sure that this transition is ultimately not just smooth, but also fair and equitable. Why is this fair and equitable transition important? Well, here you see a slide from a paper that was published in 2020 by Greg Muthett and Shivan Kartha. And here they quite clearly highlight the differences between countries when it comes to the transition ahead. First of all, the transition ahead might be more difficult simply because some countries are more dependent on fossil fuels than others. I'm thinking particularly of countries in the MENA region, but also others that are very heavily dependent on fossil fuels for their overall income. But moreover, there's also a major difference in terms of the capacity of funding the transition away from fossil fuels. And here we see countries like Norway, of course, not only being less dependent on fossil fuels, but also having a much greater capacity to move away from fossil fuels than other countries. So clearly we need to think about how international cooperation and burden sharing can be addressed through international cooperation. And we do think that international agreements can play a major role here. But before we sketch the options for international agreements and go to the questions about clubs or multilateral agreements, we'll first talk a little bit more about the broader political landscape in which these calls for international corporations have emerged. And I will hand it over now to Pete to take you through that.
Yeah, thanks very much. So next slide, please, Harro. And thanks to Anastasia for the introduction. So yeah, of course, all of these discussions about whether a club arrangement or multilateral treaty might be the preferable way forward, or whether they're ultimately compatible and part of a spectrum. There's clearly a wider context of a set of pressures and drivers, if you like, of supply side policy. And so any international agreement, we're arguing, would be driven by a confluence of different things that are to some extent going on or that may gain in strength over time. So there's momentum from first mover countries, and by that we mean countries that have already agreed to leave certain reserves of fossil fuels in the ground through some of the measures that Harro was describing before. So it could be bans or moratoria or removals of subsidies, etc., phase down policies. And so that would be countries like Denmark or Costa Rica or Ireland, France, New Zealand, a number of countries that have made moves along those lines that fall into this category of first movers. But then secondly, there's the broader economics of this, the fact that renewable energy is increasingly cost competitive vis-a-vis fossil fuels. And so there's a strong economic case for moving in that direction, irrespective of broader policy shifts that might or might not take place. Then, of course, there's bottom-up pressure for divestment from fossil fuels. There's obviously a very active global movement towards divestment, putting pressure on pension funds and others and sovereign wealth funds to divest assets in fossil fuels, combined with concerns over stranded assets. And of course, that's been leading to waves of shareholder activism in different parts of the world. We've seen litigation against governments and corporations, putting them under pressure to align or to justify how their policies and planned investments are compatible with the Paris Agreement. We're seeing resistance from indigenous movements, environmental movements and others, so blocking fossil fuel intensive infrastructures such as pipelines. We've seen that in the US, we've seen it in various parts of the world. And the Indigenous Environment Network, for example, has a huge report documenting their role in resisting many of these things and therefore avoiding a lot of carbon being emitted into the atmosphere. And then slightly more on the inside track, if you like, of activism, we're seeing a lot of campaigns, some of them quite effective, in pushing to limit subsidies, to limit export finance for fossil fuels, or to try and bring about reforms in the lending portfolios of regional and multilateral development banks. And then finally, the final point there is, of course, the campaign, which is hugely growing in momentum for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty itself. So that's just by way of the broader politics. Next slide, please. So what we do in the paper then is construct two ideal types, and we'll discuss later on whether they, as I said before, whether they might be combined. One is this club model. So examples of that would be the Powering Past Coal Alliance or the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance that was announced at the Glasgow summit. Participation at the moment is fairly narrow. So there's some core members, there's associate members, there's Friends of Boga, for example. Clearly, it's not legally binding, it's voluntary at the moment, and therefore levels of institutionalization are relatively low. And then we combine that with a treaty model, which follows a classic model of a multilateral environmental agreement, of which there are many, and many of you will be familiar with them, where participation is much broader. Largely including states, but there's scope for participation of non-state actors as well, where many of them are legally binding, so it's not entirely voluntary, and where you have higher levels of institutionalization. You'll have a secretariat, provision for regular meetings, stock takes, oversights, compliance and implementation, so much higher levels of institutionalization overall. And with that, I'll hand back to Harro.
All right, thanks, Pete. Yeah, so let me just say a few things about clubs and how they could look like. So the idea of a club is that a small group of states would informally agree to coordinate their fossil fuel phase-out policies. And this approach would clearly be in line with some of the activities and some of the initiatives that we're already seeing in the context of international climate policy. So we see any number of coalitions in a broad set of areas in international climate policy, but also a few specifically focused on fossil fuels. And Pete already mentioned the main one, the Powering Past Coal Alliance, which was created a number of years ago, but specifically driven by the United Kingdom and Canada, as well as the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, or BOGA, which was created last year by Costa Rica and Denmark. But we also see other initiatives emerging. And again, the Glasgow Climate Summit last year was very interesting in that regard, because there was also a separate statement on international public support for the clean energy transition, which commits its signatories to ending public finance for unabated fossil fuels by the end of 2022. So we see some movement among a limited group of countries that really tries to take action on fossil fuel. And we are basically, our first model is basically trying to see if we can build on these models, and then thinking about, well, how could such a club then look like, focusing on fossil fuel production more widely. Now, if we want to look at that, we can first look at the participants. So who would actually participate in such a fossil fuel supply club? The first thing to think about then would be to focus on the first movers that we already mentioned. So those countries like Costa Rica, like France and New Zealand, that have already adopted some kind of fossil fuel supply side policy. although it might be unlikely at this stage, or at least initially, that also major fossil fuel producers would be included initially, having at least a number of these first movers on board would already be an important first step. But we can also think about other countries which might not necessarily be fossil fuel producers themselves, but might still lend moral weight to any such initiatives. And we can think in this regard of countries like climate vulnerable nations in the Pacific, which already a few years ago called for a coal mining moratorium, but also these developed countries which might not necessarily have a major interest in fossil fuel production themselves, but might still lend moral weight to any such initiative, including a club. But one of the advantages of a club is also that it provides space for non-state and subnational actors, so cities, investors, companies, civil society organizations, to join more directly than what might be possible in a treaty context. And here we can think of these actors actually also submitting their own commitments. And we can think of subnational actors such as California, where we might think that the federal government or a federal government might not be willing to join any type of club like this, but there might be more progressive subnational actors that actually would be willing to take that step further. And again, it's interesting to see what has happened with the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, which indeed has already several subnational governments as some kind of member, maybe not the highest type of membership, but at least some type of member already. Which brings us to the second point, which is the type of commitments that actors, including states, but also subnational actors and possibly non-state actors, might actually take on when they're joining a fossil fuel supply club. And here, as we're saying, in our ideal type club, we're thinking primarily of informal commitments, so non-legally binding commitments, but they could still be quite specific, for example, by specifying a phase out of fossil fuels by a given date, whether it's 2030, 2040, or another date, but these would be the types of commitments that could be adopted. We can also think, and this again based on the experience that Peter already highlighted here with the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, of specific membership tiers. So it might be that some actors, whether again it's a state actor or a non-state actor, might be interested in joining, but they might not be able to fully sign up on a specific commitment to phase out fossil fuel by a given date. And we can think of different tiers, like we can think of like a low entry tier that makes it easy for these actors to still sign up on the initiative. And we can think of more, let's say, gold membership, where a government really would sign up to all of the commitments and also includes follow-up and reporting to make sure that they are indeed making progress to those commitments. Now, again, moving on to the next part is the types of activities that any such club would actually undertake. And also here, reporting and actually following up on the types of activities or the types of commitments that the actors undertake is a very important first step. So showing that progress actually is being made and putting in place the mechanism to track that progress through reporting, through review, would be an important activity that could be undertaken under such a club. But there might be also other types of activities that a club could easily undertake, including carrying out studies on whether the fossil fuel production is aligned with climate goals, collecting data on fossil fuel production more generally, but also fostering stakeholder dialogue and sharing best practices, including, for example, on planning of just transitions, and lastly, facilitating clean technology cooperation. Now, a final question, which is a question that always will come up in the context of any discussion of clubs. So what are the actual club benefits? So why would a non-member actually want to join the club? And here we can think of several types of benefits that could be shared by club members. So first, there could be access to clean technologies. That could be one way of materially having a club benefit. But there might also be non-material benefits, including reputational benefits of those who are first movers, and that would enhance the reputation both with civil society movements within the country, as well as civil society organizations outside of the country. But we can also think maybe more concretely in the form of sticks. Might there be a possibility for actually having sanctions on non-members? So basically making it attractive to join the club simply because otherwise you would have sanctions imposed on you. And here we can think about possible trade measures. For example, restrictions on the imports of fossil fuels from non-members might be a way of actually inducing cooperation in this club. So these are just some of the options and some of the ways in which a club could take shape. But of course, we there are many options, all depending on who is actually on board and what type of club they might want to see emerging. And with that, again, I'll pass it on to Pete, who will talk to you about a fossil fuel treaty.
Thanks very much. So yeah, a fossil fuel treaty could take a number of different forms. One of the key overall objectives would probably, in the light of the conversation we've been having already, to try and align fossil fuel production plans with the temperature goals of the Paris Agreement. So in other words, it would be complementary to the Paris Agreement. It would deal with some of the issues that are not addressed in the Paris Agreement. As Harro said earlier, fossil fuels are not even mentioned directly in the Paris Agreement. And in the paper, we sketched some of the principles that could appear in the treaty. Many of them are drawn from other bodies of international environmental or human rights law or in international economic law that we think would have to feature in a treaty of this nature. Now, one of them is clearly comes from the climate regime, is this notion of common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities. So it's recognizing that the responsibility to act is a shared one, it's a common one, but clearly some countries have more responsibility than others. And of course, in this case, the onus would be on richer countries, those that have burnt most of the carbon budgets and benefited most from fossil fuel use historically, to act first. But also recognizing as part of the just transition that, and as Harro was showing before from the work of Greg Muttit and others, that there's uneven capacity to transition away from fossil fuels, and that would have to be clearly recognized in any such treaty. Some of the basic principles around polluter pays would inform an assessment of commitments and who should move first and sequencing of commitments. There might be provision for non-regression, which appears in human rights and other instruments. In other words, it's a ratcheting up mechanism. There's no scope to retract and move backwards on commitments. A notion of prevention of harm that's written into lots of international environmental law, and mention of a just transition, which is invoked in the Paris Agreement itself. And so there would broadly be three pillars to the treaty, and this would be backed up by a COP type, so a Conference of the Parties type body that would potentially meet annually and review commitments and review the work that governments are undertaking towards the overall goals of the agreement, and that would be steered and financed and resourced by a secretariat. Next slide, please, Harro. So these would be the three pillars, and these very roughly follow the three pillars of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and that's really how this idea first emerged. It was on the anniversary, the 50th anniversary of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, that Andrew Sims and I were thinking about what it would mean to think about a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. And so our interpretation of the three pillars and applying it to fossil fuels looks like this, where the first pillar would be about stopping new production effectively, so non-proliferation, not making the problem worse, so commitments to end new exploration in richer countries first, obviously, and expansion into new reserves. The second one would be about what's sometimes referred to as managed decline. How do you go for an equitable phase out of existing fossil fuel investments and infrastructures that's compatible with the overall goals of the Paris Agreement? And a third pillar, so under the nuclear one, this is about peaceful use. Here it would be about a just transition. What does it mean to finance and support an accelerated move away from fossil fuels? So taking seriously the issues of energy poverty and the need for energy access in large parts of the world, but trying to make sure that that is financed and supported in a way that's no longer dependent on fossil fuels and far more reliant on renewable energy of one sort or another. Next slide, please. So there's clearly a number of steps between the sorts of club arrangements that Harro was describing and the actual emergence of a treaty. One thing that was launched just a few weeks ago back in the New York Climate Week was a global registry of fossil fuels. So this is partly involving the campaign as well as groups like Carbon Tracker to try and produce a more systematic, more transparent, as universal as it can be, overview of planned fossil fuel production, which is obviously a critical first step in making decisions about what can be burned and by whom. Who's entitled to burn the remaining carbon budget? Where are these key decisions being made, and what can we do to try and shape them? So transparency is a sort of key underpinning part of the treaty. There was also interest and discussion about a possible World Commission on fossil fuels, and the parallel here would be the World Commission on dams that we had many years ago. So it's a process of a sort of state-of-the-art overview of hydroelectric dams in that case, fossil fuels in this case, to understand what are some of the key social environmental impacts of fossil fuels, and then to start issuing recommendations, to build consensus and issue recommendations about ways to minimise and deal with some of those impacts. Clearly, a treaty of this nature would need implementation and a compliance mechanism, and that could be at the level of capacity building and financial support to help countries in that transition away from fossil fuels. But it could also, at the other end of the spectrum, include harder measures, if you like, and those could take the form of things like restrictions on market access, so that access to participation in fossil fuel markets would only be available to those countries that have signed the treaty. So this is the sort of model that operates in the Montreal Protocol, for example, on ozone depletion. But you could also imagine other forms of trade measures if there was appetite for that. And in terms of the financing, in one of the papers that we produced early on to sketch out what this treaty might do, we talked about a global transition fund that could be financed by a carbon tax or by redirecting the $11 million a minute that still circulate in the global economy in the form of fossil fuel subsidies. So there'd have to be an attempt to sort of finance that mechanism and use those funds to try and support poorer countries in particular in their transition away from fossil fuels. Next slide, please. So we conclude the paper really by sort of assessing against these criteria, the ones that you can see on the left of the slide there. So speed, level of regulatory ambition, participation and equity. We try and compare across the club model on the one hand and the treaty model on the other. And with speed, obviously, clubs, because of the smaller number of participants, the fact that they're voluntary, are easier to get off the ground. Treaties are generally slower to negotiate, but then end up often being, ultimately more comprehensive, potentially more effective. But we do note there are exceptions where treaties can be negotiated in a very short space of time. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty being an example. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons would be another. Around regulatory ambition, clearly, the greater the participation, particularly if we were trying to bring on board fossil fuel producers, the greater the effectiveness. Bans and restrictions may be more amenable to a treaty where you try and generalize those sorts of supply side policies, and that might lend itself more to a treaty type arrangement. Around participation, a club has less possibility perhaps of using some of the compliance mechanisms that I was talking about before in terms of restricting market access or trade measures, for example. On the other hand, pressure to join a club can come from many sources. So there's that sort of reputational drive, or it's something that governments might be pressured into doing, as many of them have done, or the reputational benefits or the access to technology cooperation that might drive participation in a club arrangement. Now, in terms of equity, because of these thorny intra-societal and inter-societal equity issues, clearly a treaty would be better placed to sort of incorporate and act and realise principles of common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities, and to oversee and to resource and distribute funds through a financial mechanism of the sort that I described previously. Next slide, please. So just finally, although throughout the paper and in this presentation, we've set them up as distinct models, a club on the one hand and a treaty on the other, in reality, and perhaps we're seeing evidence of this already, they could be sequential, right? You might have a club arrangement like Beyond Oil and Gas that evolves over time and brings in more members. That's certainly its aspiration. And in that sense, it becomes a stepping stone. It's building the political momentum towards what might ultimately become a broader multilateral treaty. So it's doing some of that political work. It's offering opportunities for leadership that will lay the groundwork for the broader forms of cooperation that would be required for a global fossil fuel treaty. And with that, we'll end there. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for a great presentation. We have a couple of questions. One question is, would the harder measures such as market and trade restrictions apply just to the producers of fossil fuels? Or would such restrictions also apply to the countries purchasing the fossil fuels? Many of the countries currently dependent on the use of dirty fossil fuels are very poor countries. Shall I read all the questions, or
I think we can take one by one
Okay.
at a time. I think might be. So I think the question here, and I guess the question can be posed both in the context of a club as well as in the context of a treaty. But maybe in the context of a treaty, this question clearly has equity implications, right? Like, so not all countries are in the same position to comply if you have a treaty. And I think this is what Pete already indicated in the slides on the fossil fuel treaty. Provision would need to be made for the position of certain poorer countries. And I think the treaty is generally quite well positioned to do so. So if you're talking about trade restrictions, you need to be, of course, be very careful with how you're implementing them. Because not only might it be legal challenges, but I don't think we necessarily need to talk about that now, but particularly the political challenges of including any such measure in the context of a fossil fuel treaty. If a country is not complying with it, then I think the focus should maybe rather be for the poorer countries, what kind of financial support can they get? So rather than trying to impose or use the stick, instead use the carrot for those countries. So I think that would be my answer in the context of a fossil fuel treaty. In the context of a club, I guess addressing this comment would be harder. Because in a way, basically why you want to use trade measure is to get more club members on board. And you're kind of a little bit, you don't necessarily distinguish between what non-members there are. So there, I think the equity implications and the equity concerns might be a little bit bigger as well. So I think, and this also resonates with one of the findings that we included, is that these equity concerns are very real, and I think they are more easy to, well, relatively easier to address in a fossil fuel treaty.
Yes, maybe I can just sort of briefly add to that. I mean, I think to some extent we're seeing harder measures, obviously not in the context of the treaty, being used. If you think like the carbon border adjustment measures being used by the EU, that's about trying to eliminate comparative advantages being secured by countries like China that have less, fewer restrictions on carbon intensive production. So there is an appetite to use those sorts of measures. Whether countries would be willing to include them in a broader treaty is another question. And I think, Harro's quite right to sort of say, from an equity point of view, it would be about trying to build alternatives. I think that has to be the starting point. That it's about, how do you meet energy needs in a lower carbon and more equitable way, rather than penalising poorer countries that are still heavily dependent on fossil fuels of one sort or another. But clearly, again, we are seeing measures to phase out export finance. The UK's done that to some extent. Many other countries are considering some similar measures. So although people sort of say these sorts of things are impossible to imagine, they are actually happening. I guess one argument we might make is that it might be more attractive for them to happen in a multilateral fora where they're subject to some of these principles and procedures, rather than through bilateral or interregional arrangements where some of those political inequities would be heightened.
The next question is about how costly it is to pay countries that have large deposits of oil. So the question goes that there are about 1.6 trillion barrels of oil as oil reserves, and of these 300 billion are in Venezuela. This is currently owned by a combination of public and private entities. So the question is, what is the estimate of the cost of paying these countries to leave this in the ground? The issue is that the amounts are pretty big. So what is your opinion?
Harro, do you want to take it, or do you want me to jump in first?
If you go first, I'll think about it still.
Okay. Yeah, of course. I mean, this is. I think, I don't know if Harro mentioned it, but I think you did in one of your earlier comments. There was an attempt by the Ecuadorian government, right, with this USUNI initiative, to sort of say, there are these vast reserves of oil under a national park in Ecuador. Now we could either burn those and exploit those, and of course it's our right to do that as a sovereign nation. On the other hand, we realised that would be devastating in climate terms, and so an attempt was made to ask the international community for support, to reward them with enough money. I can't remember the exact formulation. It was about half the potential market value of the oil that could have been extracted, or something like that. And a few governments did contribute funds towards this fund to try and keep those reserves in the ground. Ultimately, it was unsuccessful, and the call went out for permits to drill for oil. So in that case, it was unsuccessful. But it's this tricky question: is it around compensation for potentially lost revenues, and how do you estimate what price you would set for those revenues, and over what sorts of timeframes? Particularly considering that some of that oil might not actually be profitable on markets in a stranded assets type scenario. So, like, whose calculations and over what timeframes and so on is hugely important. There's questions about what would then happen to any revenue that was forthcoming. Would it sit in a fund that was managed by the government? Would it be redirected into non-fossil fuel energy pathways? That would obviously be a key condition. So there's all sorts of problems there. And I'm guessing most of you on the call, judging by the questions, are sort of economists or thinking of the issue in those terms. The flip side of that question is, what would be the cost if all of that oil was burnt to the global economy, and the externalities associated with that? It would be absolutely vast. So when countries come up with a statement like, we need to be compensated for this amount, we also need to take into account the costs, not just for that country, but for the global economy and society, of going down a pathway of burning all of that available oil, because that would be huge as well. So I think ultimately, if you're trying to sort of think about this politically, if it's about how do you negotiate with a regime like Venezuela, ultimately, I think it would be about reducing demand. It has to be about reducing consumption of oil coming from those sorts of countries, and sending very clear and strong signals that demand for oil will decline over time. And that's about policy decisions and decisions about infrastructure. It's about financing. It's about a whole series of things, some of which might be covered under a treaty of the sort we're talking about here, but many of which would be around, decisions made by export credit agencies, about multilateral and regional development banks, but private investors as well. So it would have to be about sending very clear signals and deeds backed with fine words about drastically reducing consumption of oil, so that it became more attractive for them not to go down a pathway of exploiting all the potential oil. I don't know if Harro wants to add any more.
But maybe just briefly on the who will pay, which is of course literally the $1 billion, maybe $1 trillion question. So clearly, and this is one of the challenges that you would have with the treaty, treaties will usually be aimed at states as the first addressee. But we also know, and as you already indicate, right, so lots of these reserves are owned by state-owned entities or private multinational companies. So the question is, what mechanisms might you include in a treaty that would actually help states to pass on the bill to some of these companies? And again, in some cases, there will be state-owned enterprises in any case, and national oil companies like Saudi Aramco and others. But one of the I guess ideas one could have is like to see to what extent could you provide in a treaty for financial mechanisms that would actually impose a cost on fossil fuels, either by taxing exports or by other ways in which countries could leverage funding from these fossil fuel companies, again, whether they're state-owned or not. Whether that's going to be easy, like this is not something we haven't talked about. Of course, it's not going to be easy, but that might be one way of trying to make sure that that those who were actually responsible will ultimately foot the bill.
Just a quick question. Given that Peter mentioned demand side policies, you know, I was wondering, you know, are we putting a little bit too much emphasis and focus on supply side policies, especially in view of the Inflation Reduction Act that was enacted during the summer in the US, the circumstances in Europe where consumers and Europeans in general are forced to decrease their consumption of fossil fuels. And in many cases, this is destroyed demand that certainly in the case of Europe will not come back, even if energy levels go back to the pre-war levels. Shouldn't we, in view of the circumstances, shouldn't we put a little bit more emphasis on demand policies?
Yes, yes. I mean, it has to be both. So, I mean, Richard Dennis and Fergus Green talk about two arms of the scissors, and we had the slide on it earlier in the presentation, which is very much about that you have to try and restrict supply of fossil fuels, but you have to reduce demand for them at the same time. And so, to plug some of the gaps left by having to move away from fossil fuels and to take less pressure, or to take some of the pressure off renewables having to fill all of that gap, clearly you need to bring down demand for energy, and ultimately that's the way of getting out of the current crisis that we're in at the moment. I don't know about where you are, but in the UK, there's a big emphasis now on home insulation and trying to minimise energy use, more efficient boilers and heat pumps and all of these sorts of things to try and reduce energy use. And ultimately, it's also about planning, making public transportation more affordable. So it's not just about, mass individual auto mobility based on oil. It's really about those sorts of things in shifting the infrastructures, supporting behaviour change of one sort or another. But, it's the really boring and mundane things like energy insulation and home insulation and those sorts of things. Another part of this, we've seen a lot of activism now about fossil fuel advertising. That's another way of, preventing the generation of new demands and pressures on consumers that create expectations around high carbon lifestyles, whether that's around flying or, travel options or high carbon diets or whatever it might be. So there's a campaign called Badvertising. There's been initiatives in the Netherlands and elsewhere around fossil-free cities. Trying to restrict advertising of fossil fuel intensive products and services. So that's trying to shape patterns of consumer demand and reduce demand for fossil fuels. So I think across the board, we need to be thinking about those sorts of measures, because that makes the job of switching supply that much easier if you can drastically bring down demand. So you're absolutely right to say that's really important. I guess our starting point for putting emphasis on supply is that it's just not really mentioned in the climate architecture very much. It's very much about regulating emissions and not regulating the production side. So that's the starting point for us putting the emphasis there. But you're absolutely right that it has to be around demand and shifting patterns of consumption as well.
Thank you. Okay, we have quite a few questions. One is, how would you enforce the pillars that you're proposing? One part of the question. Second part of the question is, with respect to the proposal of transparency, one might need to think about the fact that fossil fuel production and reserves are part of national security, and countries may not be willing to reveal their actual fossil fuel reserves and production.
So maybe on the second point. So with transparency, so transparency is a key first step. And so Pete mentions the global registry on fossil fuels. And even though countries might not be willing to disclose this information, it doesn't mean that the information isn't there. It's the main challenge is that some of this information is behind paywalls because it's owned by companies such as Rystad. So what is happening with the registry is that increasingly this information is going to be coming into the public in any case. Now, whether the information is perfectly correct, I do not know. And it's also difficult to really verify, given that indeed this information is not being disclosed by governments as such. But increasingly, there will be pressure on governments to disclose this information in any case, because people can start to draw the links between fossil fuel reserves on the one hand and the climate impacts on the other hand. So what might then need to happen is a balance and a weighing of, well, these might be the national security concerns on the one hand, but these were also the climate concerns on the other hand. I cannot make that balancing act for governments individually, but I do think that it's not just about security as such. So I think transparency is a key first step. It will happen no matter what. Yes, there may be security concerns, but again, they're not the only concerns that matter.
Next question. What would be the role of geopolitics in supporting and spreading climate clubs? Should we expect large powers to use climate clubs as an extension of the day-to-day diplomacy? And if so, would that be a good thing?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, we are seeing there's things like the Net Zero Producers Forum and things like that. So some of the sort of majors are trying to demonstrate their climate commitment in their own preferred way, and often there's a big emphasis on offsets and alternatives to restricting supply. It's certainly the case that what's going on in Europe with Ukraine and Russia might drive other countries to want to intensify technology cooperation and support for renewables to reduce their dependence on imported gas. So those sorts of geopolitical developments might intensify. And it may not be in the form of climate clubs. It could be other forms of sort of energy clubs of one sort or another. But that could be one positive, if you like, development to try and strengthen ties around energy cooperation, and particularly around renewables in the wake of that sort of shift. So I think geopolitics is always there with energy. I mean, energy security and growth are so tightly connected that geopolitics runs through whichever trajectory you're talking about. And IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, has done some good work on geopolitics and renewable energy as well. I mean, clearly there's the drive towards electrification brings with it demands for critical minerals, lithium and cobalt and so on, and that intensifies pressures in certain parts of the world, parts of Africa and Asia, for example. It potentially concentrates or consolidates the power of China in some ways, and that's clearly a big concern for other parts of the world. So whichever energy pathway you take, there will be geopolitical considerations, and I think it will shape preferences that countries might or might not have for clubs versus multilateral arrangements. I guess the benefit ultimately of a multilateral arrangement where more and more of the key players come on board is that there is that pressure then on others to join and not be seen as laggards. Clearly some regimes feel that pressure far less than others. That's always going to be a constraint and a problem. But that's one way of at least sort of offsetting or diluting the effect of some of the geopolitics that would otherwise be pursued bilaterally or regionally.
I was wondering whether we have time for the last question. It's a little bit over our time, but let me go and ask. How would such a treaty consider the economic impact to a country such as Norway, which is not a poor country, but has a big part of its economy relying on oil export? Would this agreement even be feasible for such a country?
Well, it's an interesting question. Like, Norway is, of course, a very interesting case, given that it wants to portray itself as a climate leader. And if I'm not mistaken, I think it was like roughly on the same day that Norway, on the one hand, ratified the Paris Agreement, and at the same time also opened up new areas in the Arctic for oil and gas exploration. I think it's maybe the treaty, not necessarily the treaty itself, but it's also Norway that needs to think about how it wants to move forward. Like if it indeed wants to continue to be seen as a climate leader, but also how it wants to move away from oil and gas in let's say, the medium term. On top of that, and I think, yes, there will be economic impacts, because there will be economic impacts of the climate transition or the transition to net zero, full stop. What is really here important to keep in mind, of course, is that Norway for many years has been preparing for this by actually capturing the oil rents. So in that sense, Norway is in a wonderfully good position to deal with this economic impact compared to many other countries. So I would say that Norway is in probably one of the better positions to start managing this transition, managing this decline away from oil and gas. Is it going to hurt? Yes, it will still hurt. It will also hurt a country like Norway, but it would hurt other countries much more. And especially if we also take into account the climate impacts that would ultimately hurt the other countries as well. And then finally, as a short anecdote, even though one might not see Norway immediately joining anything, it is interesting that Norway is joining an initiative in which it actively wants to negotiate rules on fossil fuel subsidies. So I don't think that Norway should be counted out as such from the beginning. But of course, the specific politics might still be difficult eventually.
Thank you very much. This was a very interesting presentation. Thank you all for joining us. Just a quick reminder that our next webinar will be on October 24th, and it will be a panel discussion on international cooperation and the role of central banks. We have some very great speakers like James Edmund from the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, Isabella Ribeiro Damaso Maia from the Central Bank of Brazil, and Jean Boissineau from the Banque de France. So thank you very much all, and thank you for a very interesting presentation. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.